Good morning, friends. Chapter 12, Stout-Hearted 7. Idyllic evenings did not come often to the Whitman family, as Catherine soon learned. At any moment, day or night, an Indian or one of the immigrants might come to the door wanting food, medicine, or help for someone desperately ill. Usually the doctor answered these calls, but if he was away from home, Mrs. Whitman went, even when it meant staying up all night. Such calls had to be answered, despite what her husband had said about devoting her time to the children. Yet none of these extra drains on her strength were allowed to reduce the perfection she demanded of herself and the rest of the family. Housekeeping, study, prayers must follow exactly the rules she had learned from her own mother. A few months before, she told Catherine she had been so ill that her husband had not expected her to live. Now, though much improved, she still tired easily. And as the children discovered, she became fretful, impatient, and hard to please. On the other hand, when she was not too tired, nobody could be kinder or more patient. She made rag dolls for the small girls, sang to them, rocked them, and played games with them. No one could help loving her in these good moods. Dr. Whitman, too, enjoyed being with the children and often took one or more of them with him to visit the Indian lodges. He always carried his Bible and, if the Indians would permit, talked to them about their sins and the need of salvation, though this was something they did not like. Occasionally, they would invite him and the children to stay for a feast. To eat with one of their bighorn spoons was a special treat. Time for such pleasures, however, had to be snatched from the constant, unremitting toil in which everyone, including the smallest children, must bear a share. The coming of so many immigrants this year had exhausted the supplies Dr. Whitman had laid up. For his big family to get through the winter, every last pumpkin and squash, every potato, no matter how small, every ear of corn, every carrot, onion, and turnip must be gathered and carried to the cellar under the house. The younger children were given tin cups and told to pick up the white beans that had fallen from the split pods when the boys pulled up the dry plants. Mrs. Whitman walked along the rows behind them, and if a single bean had been missed, the child was told, "You might starve next winter for a want of that bean. Pick it up." All the clothing worn by the men, as well as by the women and children, had to be made by hand, and even a small girl must learn to sew a neat, even seam. Socks, mittens, and caps had to be knitted, and, except for study time, no girl was allowed to sit for even 5 minutes without knitting in her hands. Providing clothes for the 7 Sager children added an extra load to the usual sewing in the Whitman house. Everything they had brought with them was worn out or so badly torn that it could hardly be mended. Though Mrs. Whitman kept the girls patched as long as there was possibly a possibility of repair. Patches were no disgrace, she said, only the failure to sew them on. She herself could not do much sewing because her eyesight was poor, but with the help of immigrant women who were willing to sew in payment for supplies, and the busy fingers of the Sager girls, each child was somehow outfitted with decent clothes before cold weather came. From time to time, Mrs. Whitman would bring out dresses or shirts from a mysterious barrel that was stored away in her bedroom. Several barrels came every year from a church back east, she told the children, and it was always exciting to open them and see what they contained. Sometimes there would be good, suitable clothing, perhaps a patchwork quilt, or even wearable shoes. Other times, everything was old and not very clean. But if such garments were still held anywhere, and if they could be made over, Mrs. Whitman washed and used them. When the doctor went to Vancouver for supplies, he would bring back, and in addition to the barrels, hanks of yarn and bolts of cloth for bed sheets, shirts, and dresses. Often it was stiff, ugly material, but It was the only new cloth they had because Mrs. Whitman did not know how to spin or weave. Shoes, such as the children had worn in Missouri, were seldom to be had here in the West. To send east for shoes and get them back would take 2 years because all goods came in ships around Cape Horn and up the West Coast. By that time, their feet would have outgrown anything ordered, so they all wore moccasins made by Indian women. The girls knitted their own stockings, ripped up the old ones to get suitable yarn when no new yarn was available. With so many beds to be furnished, there must always be quilts in the process as well as clothes. Every scrap of new material that did not go into shirts or dresses was carefully cut into pieces of different shapes and sewn into quilted blocks. When enough blocks were ready, Mrs. Whitman spread them out on the floor to place the colors in the most pleasing combinations. Then the blocks were sewn in strips, and the strips in long seams to form a bed-sized quilt top. Old sheets were neatly patched, were used for the backs. Cotton batting brought up from Vancouver made the filling, and the whole quilt was sewn together in patterns of fine stitching. A new quilt was a treasure indeed. While the girls sewed, knitted, mended, and quilted, John and Frank helped cut and haul wood, often from a long distance, since trees were scarce in this area. All the water the family used had to be carried from the river, and this too was the boys' job. In order to accomplish all these things in the limit of each day's time, there had to be order and strict rules. Any child could see that, whether he liked it or not. But the children could also see that no one worked as hard or for such long hours as the doctor and his wife, who were up at 4 o'clock every morning, an hour before the children. Mrs. Whitman had a passion for cleanliness. To her, it came second only to righteousness, and according to Frank, who spent much of his time at the mansion house, some of the immigrants laughed at her for it. "Why change shirts and underwear so often?" they scoffed. "Why weekly baths? Didn't she know that bathing in winter was dangerous to the health? Did she want them to all get pneumonia?" If she heard these remarks, Mrs. Whitman paid no attention to them. The washtub used for bathing was brought into the kitchen once a week, just the way Mama used to do back in Missouri, and the whole family had to go through it. Then there were huge weekly washings. By the time Catherine came downstairs at 5 o'clock on any Monday morning, kettles were steaming on the stove, and already Dr. Whitman, Perrin, John, and perhaps even the teacher were standing over barrels half filled with hot soapy water, pounding the soiled clothes with stout sticks that had tin cones fastened to one end. Jokes and laughter filled the room, and Mrs. Whitman seemed to enjoy these Monday mornings as much as anyone. She stood in the middle of the kitchen telling everyone what to do and keeping them all singing as they worked. Catherine was not strong enough for hard physical work, so she and Frank had the job of cooking breakfast. By the time it was ready, the washing was finished and hung in the yard to dry. Sometimes Mrs. Whitman would look at the long lines of clean clothing flapping in the wind with a sort of shamed expression on her face. No wonder the Indians think we're rich. Since Mary Ann, Helen, and David called the Whitmans father and mother, the Sager girls soon began to do the same. Only John and Frank refused. Catherine knew from the look on Mother's face that she was hurt when the boys called her Mrs. Whitman. It hurt Catherine, too, because she, too, was beginning to love her new mother very much. John did, too, but not Frank, who said she corrected him too often. "But you know she says it for your own good." "How does she know what's for my good?" was Frank's angry reply. John, in his steady way, always said, "Frank, remember what she's doing for us, letting us stay here with the girls." The children soon learned that the most important part of life in this home was religion. Their own parents had been religious, but in an easy, comfortable way, very different from the anxious, almost grim manner of the Whitmans. Every morning and evening they had Bible reading and prayers. Before breakfast, each child must learn a verse from Scripture and remember it until Sunday. When that day came, all the playthings and toys, even the baby's rattle, must be put away. John and Frank openly resented having to go to so many prayer meetings. Sometimes Frank stayed away, but then Mother made special prayers for him later when he was present. He resented that too. One thing that interested all the children was roaming through the house, which was shaped like a capital letter T. The sitting room in the middle space in the crossbar with the Whitman's bedroom at one end, and at the other a large room that had an outdoor entrance leading to it. The Indians came here for school and church, but were not allowed in any other part of the house. Why is that? Frank wanted to know. They let us go into their lodges. Why can't they come into our house? You don't understand, Frank, Mother explained. They are very dirty and have vermin in their clothing and hair, and if we let them into the rest of the house, we would have no privacy at all. The long stem of the T began with the kitchen, which backed up to the sitting room. Beyond it was the teacher's bedroom and storeroom, then the schoolroom that only had one outside door to give the children the feeling of going to a separate school building. Beyond the schoolroom, the doctor planned to add more storage space and perhaps another bedroom to accommodate visitors. Only the crossbar of the T was 2 stories in height, and so far the second floor was one big room. Father said someday he would divide it with partitions so the boys and girls would have separate apartments. To the Sager children, who had always lived in one-room houses, this seemed like a palace. Almost every day, at some free moment, the girls and Frank gathered around John to tell him of their joys and sorrows. He seemed more like a father than a brother. He listened patiently, never scolded, but tried to help them accept this life that was so different from their own home. One night, he surprised the girls by saying, "Frank and I think it would be nice if we changed Rosanna's name." "What would we call her?" "Why not Henrietta Naomi for Ma and Pa?" "Oh, John, that would be lovely. Papa and Mama would like that." Father and Mother Whitman agreed. "A real tribute to your parents," Mother said. "We must begin calling her Henrietta now, so she and all of us will be used to it." That evening, when Catherine helped the baby drink her milk, which she now did very nicely from a small cup, she whispered to her, "Your name is Henrietta Naomi Sager. Now, you remember that." The newly named baby laughed. She was growing so fast. Mother said she would soon be as large as Louise. She was everybody's darling, and Catherine wondered how they could have lived without her. So remember, Papa's name was Henry, Mama's name was Naomi. So they took Henry and made it a girl form for Henrietta, and then Naomi was her middle name. So Rosanna is no longer going by Rosanna. She's gotten a name change, and she is now Henrietta Naomi Sager. All right, my friends, that's the end of chapter 12. I'll talk to you later. Bye.